This is the overview video explaining how to answer question 6 on paper 3. We'll be looking at what the examiner will be expecting and what you can do to score as many marks as you can. The question will always look like this. How far do you agree with interpretation 2 about a particular topic? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge of the historical context. Up to 4 marks of the total for this question will be awarded for spelling, punctuation, grammar, and use of specialist terminology. 20 marks. 16 of those marks are awarded for AO4, which is your analysis and evaluation of interpretations. But what does that actually mean? Now, this is quite a long question because you're awarded so many marks for it. It is going to be the longer answer. So what you need to do is reach a judgment. You need to decide, do you agree with interpretation 2 on this topic or not? And really, it doesn't matter if you choose to agree or disagree. What matters is how you can explain your choice. So once you've made a judgment on agreeing or disagreeing, you need to give evidence, explain the factors, explain your choice fully. This question focuses on the interpretations, so you need to take interpretation 2 and explain why you agree or disagree with it. Then bring in interpretation 1 and explain why you agree or disagree with that in relation to interpretation 2. So then you've made a judgment at the beginning and you've brought in evidence to explain your judgment. You've considered the interpretations to further that judgment. And you've then got a coherent, a sustained, and a very logical and structured argument. And that is essential to scoring highly on this question. You'll notice, though, that the question focuses on interpretation 2. But just because only interpretation 2 is mentioned in the question, you still need to be discussing both interpretations. So, for example, if you've chosen to agree with interpretation 2, then you also need to bring in interpretation 1 to explain why you find that less convincing, and vice versa. So always bring in both. You should also be bringing in some contextual knowledge. So this is your opportunity to show the examiner how well you know the topic. So if you've got some evidence or bits of information that you think would really help to further your argument, then bring it in. It's a fantastic opportunity to do that. Now, this certainly seems like a lot to do, and because it is a longer marked question, there is quite a lot that you need to do. So let's break it down a little bit. Really, what you need to do is identify the view being offered by the interpretations, and then explain what you think about that. So to do that, you can give some details from the interpretations, you can bring in your contextual knowledge to support or counter that view, and then bring in the other interpretation, so the one that you disagree with, and again, use your own knowledge, bring in points from that interpretation, and use that to back up the view that you gave in the beginning. The highest marks here will be awarded for answers that consistently argue the same thing. They're not going back and forth. You've brought in lots of bits of evidence, you've explained your answer fully, and got a very clear line of reasoning bringing you to that overall judgment that you made. Remember, this is about the overall judgment of the interpretations, so you don't need to be getting bogged down in details of the interpretation, but just overall, what are they arguing? Also, we're seeing the word evaluate quite a lot at the moment because it's so important for AO4, but what does evaluation actually mean? The exam board says that it's the use of precisely selected and relevant contextual knowledge to support the evaluation of the interpretation. So it's not just explaining what it's arguing, but using information around it to really understand what it's trying to get across. You will also notice that 4 marks here are available for spelling, punctuation and grammar, and we will come back to them in a moment. Here are the bottom 2 bands for this question. You'll notice that we're seeing words like straightforward, little analysis, and not specific on terms of contextual knowledge. So essentially, in these bottom 2 bands, it might mean that you're making statements about your argument and you've maybe explained them in a little bit of detail, maybe you've tried to bring in some contextual knowledge, but it's just not come together fully. So you need to be explaining those points in more detail. You need to be linking those comments back to the topic that's given to you in the question. If you are bringing contextual knowledge, that's great, but just make sure it's relevant and actually enhances what you've already said. It's also key that you are discussing both interpretations. These are the top two bands. Now to score here, we need to have a substantiated judgment. By that we mean that you've made an argument on whether or not you agree with interpretation 2, and it's fully explained. You've really got to grips with what the interpretations are getting across and explained fully why you agree or disagree with it. You've brought in contextual knowledge, which shows a very detailed knowledge of the topic, and use that to support your argument. Finally, the structure is very clear. The examiner can follow exactly what you're trying to say, why you're bringing in certain factors, certain bits of context, and it's coherent, it's fully developed, and it's easy to follow. Remember that 4 additional marks are available for your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Now that doesn't mean that you have to do anything different or special as such, but it's just a really good idea to take a bit more caution maybe. So once you've finished writing your answer, if you have time, just read through it quickly to see if you've made any silly mistakes, such as maybe sentences that are a bit too long, or words aren't spelt correctly and things like that. If you can use subject-specific vocabulary, then that's great, but don't feel like you have to put it in just to show the examiner that you know it. It's more important that you're using the right word that actually fits in the sentence than something technical that actually doesn't really work. Generally speaking though, as long as your spelling, punctuation and grammar are good enough that the examiner can understand what you mean, then you should be able to secure at least a couple of marks here. So don't worry too much about this. Finally, let's take a look at an example. This question says, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about popular opposition to US involvement in the Vietnam War? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge of the historical context. Up to 4 marks of the total for this question will be awarded for spelling, punctuation, grammar, and use of specialist terminology, 20 marks. Here's the mark then for this question. Now you can see at the top that we've briefly summarised what the interpretation is arguing. In this case, that media coverage significantly impacted popular opinion on the war because it highlighted the brutality of the conflict. So let's say, for example, that you've chosen to support this claim. Then you might say that interpretation 2 suggests that media coverage was key to the turning of public support for US involvement. So there, we've made really clear that we understand what the overall argument of the interpretation is, but further to that, why we agree with it, why do we find it convincing? Now that's your opportunity to bring in some contextual knowledge, to fully explain that, maybe bring in some detail from interpretation 2 to back up your point, and just make sure that everything is linked back to the topic given to you in the question. It's also important that you bring in interpretation 1. So again, summarise what interpretation 1 says, but then why you don't find that convincing. Is there a particular phrase in interpretation 1 that you don't think is valid? Is there some contextual knowledge that you have that you think disproves what they're trying to argue?